Welcome to today's seminar, everyone. I'll be your professor for today's historical explainer, and we are going to be diving deep into the complex historical and psychological dimensions of Jonah chapter 4. So often this text gets reduced to just a simple children's story, right? A guy, a boat, and a giant fish. But as we unpack the actual historical documents and the linguistic nuances today, we're going to discover a profound and honestly deeply troubling psychological case study. We are looking at a man grappling with severe depression, deep ethnocentric bias, and an intense ideological conflict with the very deity he's supposed to be serving. Here is our agenda for today's explainer. 1. Context, the Assyrian threat. 2. The prophet's anguished journey. 3. From anger to resignation. 4. The lesson of the vine. And 5. Analyzing the final dialogue. All right, let's jump right into section 1. Context, the Assyrian threat. To really understand the root of our protagonist's profound conflict, we have to establish the geopolitical climate. Without this context, Jonah just seems inexplicably stubborn. So, we're in the first half of the 8th century BC, specifically during the reign of King Jeroboam II. At this time, the Assyrian Empire represented a massively ominous growing threat to Israel's borders. And Nineveh? That was a major, populous city of this empire, sitting right on the east bank of the Tigris River. Now, when Jonah is called to go east to Nineveh, what does he do? He goes to Joppa and boards a ship heading as far west as humanly possible, likely toward Tarshish in modern-day Spain. This wasn't just him dreading a long commute. This was a deep-seated, intense nationalistic fear. To Israel, the Assyrians were a ruthless, violent people. Jonah knew perfectly well that a weak or destroyed Nineveh meant a safe Israel. So his resistance was completely fueled by this intense anxiety that if Nineveh repented and actually got spared by God, they would eventually turn around and destroy his own homeland. A geopolitical fear, by the way, that literally came true decades later. That sets the stage for section 2, the prophet's anguish journey. Let's trace the psychological odyssey that brings Jonah to a hill east of the Assyrian capital. It is a journey marked by some pretty wild behavioral swings. The text gives us a stark psychological devolution across 4 chapters. Think of it like this. In chapter 1, Jonah is running completely away from the Lord, totally disobedient. In chapter 2, he's running to the Lord, incredibly thankful for being saved from drowning in the sea. In chapter 3, he's running with the Lord, obediently preaching a 40-day warning to the people of Nineveh. But then, we hit chapter 4, and he is running squarely against the Lord. The whole narrative culminates in this severe ideological fury, where Jonah is basically forced to confront his own deep prejudices. Linguistically, there's a fascinating shift that occurs the moment Nineveh actually repents. The text tells us Jonah was very upset, and it uses the Hebrew word charach. This literally translates to burn or to be kindled with anger. What's revealing here is that his reaction wasn't just a fleeting tantrum. Chara indicates a deep, unsettling emotional upset. He was experiencing a fundamental internal clash between his own strict demand for pure justice against his enemies and God's inclination toward merciful goodness. Which brings us to section 3, from anger to resignation. This intense, burning anger quickly devolves into a profound, depressive resignation. Jonah isolates himself outside the city walls, setting up a little shelter, just waiting to see if God might still wipe Nineveh off the map. But we need to pause here and use the Socratic method for a second. Why would a prophet actively desire the swift and complete destruction of the exact people he was sent to warn? Usually, if you're preaching, you're thrilled when your audience actually listens. But Jonah reveals his core theological rationale here. He knew God was gracious, compassionate, and slow to anger. He fled in the first place precisely because he knew God would forgive them if given half a chance. Jonah felt a sense of ownership over the message, and he simply could not process a reality where God would forgive Israel's brutal, historic enemies. The original Hebrew text actually frames the survival of Nineveh as a great evil to Jonah. It's a complete inversion of his moral and theological value system. The word evil frames this entire historical text. We see the evil of Nineveh, the evil of the storm. But the specific phrase, great evil, that is only applied to Jonah's reaction to grace. What immensely pleased God deeply and fundamentally displeased Jonah. God sparing the city was an absolute psychological disaster in the eyes of the prophet. So, overwhelmed by this unrelenting emotional distress and what he views as entirely unjustified mercy toward his enemies, Jonah expresses literal suicidal ideation. He flat out tells God, "It is better for me to die than to live."
The chief cause of his desire to die isn't that he failed. It's a success that he vehemently disagrees with. His anger leads to isolation. He shuts down communication with God, and we see a total collapse of his will to live. He essentially declares that a world where his enemies are shown mercy is a world he absolutely refuses to participate in.
Moving on to Section 4, the lesson of the vine. Let's examine the didactic narrative that follows. God uses a physical, environmental object lesson to confront Jonah's rapidly deteriorating psychological state. To challenge Jonah's stubborn silence, divine providence orchestrates the sudden growth of a shade-giving vine. And the text notes that Jonah rejoiced with a great rejoicing. Honestly, it's the only time in the entire historical record that Jonah is described as happy, and it's solely because of his own personal comfort from the blistering heat. But God's lesson is incredibly sharp here. The very next day at dawn, God deploys a worm. A simple cutworm severs the stem, destroying the plant overnight. Think about that. The only thing actually destroyed in this entire narrative about destruction is this one plant. And its loss completely breaks Jonah.
To make matters worse, the situation is compounded by a sirocco, or sharav. This is a scorching, dry east wind carrying fine dust, a very real, documented climate reality in the region of ancient Nineveh. Historically, this specific wind is known to cause severe exhaustion, feelings of unreality, and truly bizarre behavior. The text paints this vivid picture of the sun literally striking or beating down on the prophet's head. Physically battered by the extreme heat and psychologically shattered by the loss of his one and only comfort, Jonah grows faint and once again begs for death.
And finally, Section 5, Analyzing the Final Dialogue.
We now arrive at the resolution of our lecture, a masterful textual analysis of the final dialogue between the divine and the prophet. This is where the tension between human expectation and divine reality absolutely peaks. Mapping out this narrative reveals a fascinating literary structure known as a chiasmus, an A, B, B', A' pattern. It's a symmetrical framing that perfectly contrasts the unyielding mercy of God with the unyielding bitterness of Jonah. We see God's mercy in extending a second chance to Nineveh, followed by Jonah's first angry outburst. Then we have the vine incident, leading to Jonah's second angry outburst, justifying his fury over the plant. And finally, the structure resolves right back where it started, with God's ultimate declaration of mercy.
This brilliant structure drives home the central climax of the lecture, the stark contrast between Jonah's pity for an unearned plant and God's pity for a vast, morally confused population. The text uses a classic rhetorical argument from the lesser to the greater. God essentially tells Jonah, "You pity a plant you didn't plant, you didn't tend to, and which existed for exactly one night. Should I not pity a city I created, sustained, and love?" The pure absurdity of Jonah's profound grief over a weed, while simultaneously demanding the slaughter of a massive metropolis, is laid entirely bare.
Consider the sheer scale of the historical and moral stakes here. We're talking about 120,000 citizens, and God describes them as people who cannot discern their right hand from their left. Now, this doesn't mean they were completely innocent, but rather that they were totally immersed in moral confusion and uncertainty. They lacked true spiritual revelation. God even goes out of his way to mention his compassion for the cattle in the city. The scale of God's concern spans from 120,000 human lives all the way down to the domestic livestock, directly and completely challenging Jonah's incredibly narrow, self-centered worldview.
The historical text famously concludes with this unanswered, highly provocative question: shouldn't I be concerned for Nineveh, that great city? It just ends there. We are never told if Jonah let go of his burning anger or if he stayed bitter and resigned on that dusty hill. By ending with a question, the text forces the prophet and us, the students of this history, to grapple with our own ethnocentric biases and the true limits of our compassion. Will we reflect a narrow, closed-off worldview, or can we accept a reality where grace actually extends even to our worst enemies? Something to really chew on. Class dismissed. I'll see you in our next explainer.